In June 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte crossed the Niemen River with over 600,000 men, the largest army Europe had ever seen assembled in one place. Less than 6 months later, fewer than 100,000 of them would stagger back out of Russia. And given that Napoleon's own marshals, his advisors, and even his allies had warned him against this exact campaign, this raises the obvious question. Why did Napoleon invade Russia anyway? Why risk everything he'd built on a war that almost everyone around him thought was a terrible idea? So, by 1810, Napoleon controlled most of continental Europe, either directly or through client states and allies. And Russia under Tsar Alexander I was technically one of these allies. The two had signed the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, which required Russia to join Napoleon's Continental System, a trade blockade designed to strangle Britain economically by cutting off all European trade with it. The problem was that this arrangement was terrible for Russia. Its economy depended heavily on exporting grain and timber to Britain, and without that trade, the Russian economy began to crumble. By 1810, Alexander had had enough and quietly began allowing Russian ports to trade with Britain again, directly violating the treaty. This alone was seen in Paris as an act of betrayal. But Napoleon had other grievances too. Alexander had also refused to enforce anti-British trade restrictions on neutral shipping, and had raised tariffs on French luxury goods, which Napoleon saw as a deliberate provocation. And to make matters worse, there was a personal insult layered on top of all this. Napoleon had proposed marrying into the Russian royal family, and Alexander's mother had twice found ways to politely decline, which Napoleon took personally. By 1811, both sides were rearming, and it was becoming clear to Napoleon's inner circle that a war with Russia was becoming likely. And this is where the warnings started. His foreign minister at the time argued that a war with Russia would be a catastrophic overreach, that France's supply lines simply couldn't support an army that size across such vast distances. Several of his marshals expressed similar concerns privately, having seen firsthand how difficult the logistics of previous campaigns had already been. Even some of Napoleon's own family members reportedly urged caution. But Napoleon dismissed these concerns. He was, after all, coming off over a decade of nearly uninterrupted military success. And he believed Russia would either sue for peace quickly or be defeated in a single decisive battle, much like Austria and Prussia had been. So, in June 1812, despite the warnings, Napoleon assembled the Grande Armée, a multinational force pulled from across his empire and crossed into Russian territory. The Russians, heavily outnumbered, refused to fight the decisive battle Napoleon wanted. Instead, under General Barclay de Tolly, they retreated deeper into Russian territory, burning crops, supplies, and villages as they went, denying the French army the ability to live off the land the way it usually did. This scorched-earth strategy was deeply unpopular with the Russian public and nobility, who saw the retreats as cowardice, and Alexander eventually replaced Barclay with Mikhail Kutuzov to appease them. But fun fact, Kutuzov mostly continued the same strategy. By September, the two armies finally clashed at Borodino, the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars, with staggering casualties on both sides. Napoleon technically won the battle in that the Russians withdrew, but he failed to destroy their army, which was the entire point of forcing a battle in the first place. A week later, French forces entered Moscow, expecting Alexander to negotiate. Instead, the city was found largely evacuated, and shortly after Napoleon's arrival, fires broke out and burned most of it to the ground, denying the French the supplies and shelter they desperately needed heading into winter. Napoleon waited in the ruins of Moscow for over a month, expecting a Russian surrender that never came. By the time he finally ordered the retreat in October, it was already too late to avoid the brutal Russian winter. The retreat became a catastrophe. Freezing temperatures, starvation, disease, and constant harassment from Russian forces and Cossack raiders devastated what remained of the Grande Armée. Of the roughly 600,000 men who had crossed into Russia, only a fraction would ever make it back out. So why did Napoleon do it, when so many people around him said not to? The first reason was simply his track record. By 1812, Napoleon had spent over a decade winning campaigns that other European leaders considered unwinnable, and this created a deep overconfidence, both in himself and in how his enemies would behave. He expected Alexander to fight a conventional war and negotiate once beaten, the same pattern that had worked against Austria, Prussia, and others. The second reason was that Napoleon believed the economic and political stakes were too high to ignore. Russia's quiet abandonment of the Continental System threatened the entire foundation of his strategy against Britain. And if Russia could defy him without consequence, other allied and client states might follow, unraveling his control over Europe. The third reason was that Napoleon fundamentally misunderstood the scale of the challenge. He planned the campaign assuming a short, decisive war of a few months, the same way his previous wars had gone, and never seriously prepared for a prolonged conflict deep inside a country as vast as Russia, where supply lines would stretch beyond breaking point. And the final reason was that Napoleon simply didn't believe Russia would employ the strategy it did. He expected pitched battles, not a scorched-earth retreat that would trade territory for time and let winter do the fighting for them. In the end, the very warnings Napoleon dismissed turned out to be exactly right, and the invasion that was supposed to cement his dominance over Europe instead marked the beginning of his empire's collapse.